Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode of the Embellish Podcast, a podcast focused on product stories, product storytellers, interesting brand ambassadors, and anything else that I happen to come up with. Whether you're a bourbon fan, a geek, casual observer, or someone just floating through this channel, I hope you find it interesting. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, please let me know and I'll try to get that taken care of. You can get a hold of me at embellishpod@gmail.com. I also generally live stream the recording of these episodes on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or Twitter with the same handle. I also have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today is November the 3rd, and we're going to be talking about Tennessee whiskey. And when I think about Tennessee whiskey, I'm not immediately singing the Chris Stapleton song. I get one of two thoughts: Moonshine distilleries and the jewel kitsch tourism capital of the state in the Gatlinburg or Pigeon Forge area, or Jack Daniels. That's kind of the two things that come to the forefront of my mind. But if you pay attention, there's a ton of Tennessee commodity whiskey that's going into blends and some of the most sought after brands out there. And it's also becoming this wonderful whiskey geek trope to poke fun at another major distillery out of the state. Before we get too far down that path, though, let's talk about some very recent news that has popped up in the last couple of days. It seems like financiers, investment firms, and everybody else is interested in getting into the whiskey game. We had Pritzker Financial that bought into BBC. Barstow Bourbon Company picks up Green River. The folks at Widow Jane get bought out. I think Few gets bought out. A whole bunch of people are starting to get bought out. And then this week, we have a big one. We have Wilderness Trail is bought by Campari, roughly a $600 million valuation. They're buying 70% of the company with 30% to be bought in a handful of years, which is, I think, super smart for the folks at Wilderness Trail, because maybe the value of Wilderness Trail increases. And so if they're going to buy out the final 30%, are they going to continue at the valuation of 600 million or whatever the valuation is at the moment that they're going to buy that final 30%? Or do they have it to just kind of sell out to somebody else? And you may be familiar with Campari. They've bought a bunch of stuff, but specifically they have Wild Turkey as well. And so, what's the encouraging thing, I guess, for me is that for the way that they've handled their ownership of Wild Turkey, hopefully they don't push in too hard on Wilderness Trail either. They kind of treated it with the same way as, we bought this particular brand because of its high degree of success. Its success has come because of the people, and so don't touch it. Kind of like let it do its thing. There's a reason why we decided we wanted to get into it, and maybe they're just wanting to make sure nobody else is hanging out in the whiskey space with the WT initials. If that's the case, maybe one of us should take a little bit of money and maybe we start up our own whiskey brand called Wild Trek or something like that. We can all hop out there, maybe pick up a $400 million paycheck in a handful of years. But obviously they've been doing something great. And then following on the heels of that, Balcones gets picked up by Diageo. Diageo owns a whole bunch of stuff. No financial details disclosed here, but there's some consolidation that's happening across craft and major brands. After that, we're talking about antique collection. It's that time of the year. Everybody's looking for the William LaRue Wellers and the George T. Staggs and all the rare 1700-year-old whatever. But Buffalo Trace is making some changes to the way that they allocate. And I've noticed at least a handful of medium-sized channels that are now being left out of their allocation. So the only thing that I would kind of push out there is that if you are a mid-tier craft distiller, now is your time to get a whole bunch of airtime. If you've got a special release, kick it out to some of these folks that aren't getting their normal allotments of BTAC, and I guarantee you can get a lot of free advertising and free publicity. And if it's really, really good, maybe there's some some press and publicity that they can feed off of that. It's a really really good opportunity for some folks to do it. Obviously, I'm not one of those types of channels or podcasters. I don't do a ton of reviews. Do a lot of brand education because that's the thing that's interesting to me, and I don't have a palate that's strong enough to do reviews. But you'll catch occasional one on my Instagram or something along that lines. Um, but like I said, there's some great opportunity out there for some mid-tier to craft distillers that are doing interesting things out in the marketplace, with a lot of people being left out in the dark or out in the cold with no access to things that they've had access to in the past. And you know that it's not a lack of product availability; it's more of a business decision that Buffalo Trace has made, and they're more than welcome to make that. That's the thing that they're allowed to do. But we'll kind of see how that plays out for them. So for tonight's episode, we're going to talk about Tennessee whiskey, and we're not actually. I've got 6 bottles. We're going to drink through a few of them. Maybe I'm going to do a little bit of Halloween pairing. I've got some Whoppers, which are my kind of my favorite non-mainstream candy. Whoppers can be considered mainstream, but it's not something that you're normally going to pick up in a gas station. You might be at the movie theater or whatever. But we'll just kind of see which one of these 6 particular brands that are Tennessee whiskey brands. We're not necessarily drinking Tennessee whiskey because one of the things that will stick out there, Tennessee whiskey for me is not significantly different than bourbon. There's this discussion around the Lincoln County process and whether that makes it bourbon or not bourbon. But realistically, in most or a lot of international trade agreements where they start standardizing definitions across countries, Tennessee whiskey has been defined as bourbon in a lot of international trade agreements. And so it's basically the same thing. They just have an additional process that they go through to call it Tennessee whiskey, where it's Lincoln County. Lincoln County is that charcoal filtration process that kind of put in there. And I think there's one exception for Pritchard's, for Benjamin Pritchard's process, but that's neither here nor there. And so we'll talk about some bourbons. We'll talk about some Tennessee whiskeys, and we might even talk about a single malt kind of a process here. But there's a couple big name brands out there. The Jack Daniels. We're not talking about them tonight because if you know about Tennessee whiskey, you know about Jack Daniels. Not going to talk about Uncle Nearest, which is another Tennessee whiskey, mainly because we already have. Not going to talk about Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery, mainly because hopefully sometime this month they will be joining me for an episode. They're going to hop on. The Nelson brothers are going to hop on. We'll talk through some stuff, taste some of their new Nelson brothers stuff. And I've been a big fan of theirs for a long time. I actually toured the distillery really, really quickly after they opened, just by chance. I was able to pick up a single barrel. This was before I started collecting whiskey super, super heavy. So I just picked one up because it was good. And then I continued to nurse that for as long as I possibly could because they got found real fast. And of course, their distillate at that point in time was coming from Indiana. But they have their own Tennessee whiskey line as well now. But we're not going to talk about them much more tonight because we're going to talk about them some more later on. We've talked about them before. We'll talk about it again. So same thing with Uncle Nearest. I'm sure we'll talk about them again. Jack Daniels. Doesn't need me to talk about them. Everyone in the world knows who they are. Maybe we need to talk about some of their other stuff. But the first one of the night, and it's going to be probably the most nefarious or most ill-reputed Tennessee whiskey that's kind of on the market right now, and that's Dickel. And Dickel, if we're looking at the state of Tennessee, if you know where Nashville is, it's southeast of Nashville, a little bit closer to Manchester. And so if you're a big Bonnaroo fan, you know exactly where Manchester is. Maybe Dickel's an opportunity for you to visit. If you were wanting to go to Bonnaroo, you can hit up Dickel and go down to Cascade Hollow and see that. But Cascade Hollow has been Cascade Hollow Distillery, which is where Dickel is made. It's been operating since the late 1800s. It's been around. It's been a staple of the state for a very long time, but obviously it hit some rocky patches during Prohibition, because if I remember correctly, Prohibition in Tennessee started 9-10 years before Prohibition in the United States specifically hit. And so if we're talking about Prohibition becoming federal in 1919, 1910, they have a statewide prohibition. So they were able to continue to sell their Cascade whiskey as a medicinal spirit and using um, distillery equipment at the Stitzel Distillery in Kentucky. And then, um, they kind of weathered the storm of Prohibition. And Prohibition, if I remember correctly, in Tennessee also lasted longer than it did as a federal law. And then, they kind of moved down the path a little bit. New distilleries get kind of built, and they push out. Kentucky's greater than Tennessee. So I've got what I assume is going to be Scott from Bourbon Lens in the commentary here. Um, Depending upon what you're talking about, you very, very well may be true that Tennessee is greater than Kentucky. But kind of going back to this conversation, George Dickel is Cascade Hollow is a source for a lot of commodity whiskey that's going into some pretty premier brands. If I think about, and they never name some people don't ever name the distillery because of NDAs and a host of legal reasons, but we as whiskey nerds feel fairly confident that there's a lot of Dickel that's going into blends with Barrel, with Sweetens Cove, with a handful of other places, and it has its place. One of the other things that's super beneficial that I really like about them is that you can regularly go out and find 15-year-old Dickel whiskey at a reasonable price. And if you're not a person who gets super bent out of shape over some degree of minerality, then you're gonna be okay with it. And it's a really nice aged, delicious pour, at least in my mind, for a reasonable price. And so it catches a lot of crap, but it's a really good place for some folks to go out and pick up some aged distillate, try it out. A lot of people are picking it up and putting in their blends. Obviously, it's got something going on. They've been around for a while. They've got something kind of pushed out there. And then for the rest of the list that we're going to talk through some Tennessee whiskeys, we're gonna talk about probably a lot more craft distillery. And if you think about the state of Kentucky, our craft revival probably started a handful of years earlier. And we're at the place now where we have the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail is booming, and then you have a Kentucky Craft Bourbon Trail, which is a smaller portion of that. And Tennessee's finally getting to the point that it has its own bourbon trail, or whiskey trail. Sorry, Tennessee Whiskey Trail. And that's, if you want to know anything about the Tennessee Whiskey Trail, there's a website, and I put it in here somewhere, and I don't know where it is now. But I think it's like TennesseeWhiskeyTrail.com or something along that lines. We'll put it in the show notes. We'll put it in the comment section of this. But you can find a host of other distilleries, and some of them are going to be centered pretty heavily around Nashville, Tennessee, because that's one of the premier tourist spots for the state. If you're within driving distance, you've probably been to Nashville. If you've been a part of a bachelorette party, you've probably been to Nashville. It's the woo woo girls. If you fly in and out of Nashville at all, you'll see what I'm experiencing. So right outside of Nashville, in a town called Nolensville, is a distillery called Wheeler's Raid. And Wheeler's Raid is a small distillery that kind of began as a passion project in 2016. And so we're only in 2022. So we're talking about 6 years here. So obviously they're going to have some younger whiskey that's going to exist. But what they're doing is, obviously it's picking up a name for a Civil War battle that occurred in the area. But it's just more of an homage name. There's no like, Tennessee lore story that kind of goes into it. But it's at the point now where I've had 2 separate bottles of this, and their distillery specifically has a series of bourbons, right? And so they've got their original blend bourbon, and they've got a French oak bourbon. And if we kind of go back to that initial conversation, Tennessee whiskey and bourbon are largely the same thing. There's not a significant difference between the two. They also have some rye, and they get into some limited availability stuff: cask strength rye, cask strength bourbon, double oak bourbon, double barreled rye, honey finish, which, was kind of all the rage, toasted rye, honey rye. I think I had a sherry finish from them. And they just recently underwent a bottle / branding change. But the one that I have is a sort of a square bottle with, I guess I can pick it up here. It's a square bottle, and it's got, some older design to it. It's got that '06 that it looks an awful lot like the front of a Jack Daniels bottle, but they've moved to something a little bit different. It's a smaller craft distillery, regional footprint. It's the only distillery in that town, but it's on the trail, and they have a ton of offerings that are available to you, and it's kind of a really good place to pick up some Tennessee whiskey, and then staying in the same geography. There is Leaper's Fork Distillery, and Leaper's Fork Distillery is another small craft distillery. It's in Williamson County, about the same time frame. So we're looking at Wheeler's Raid, Leaper's Fork, and a handful of other people that are starting to kind of gain interest in, kind of crafting and creating whiskey. If you think about the folks at Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery, they're not too far off of the same time frame. That's when a lot of people were picking up interest, kind of riding on the coattails of the bourbon boom. But they're kind of sticking to Middle Tennessee, being, small batch whiskey production, and trying to reestablish Tennessee as one of the 4 main whiskey making regions of the world. And I think they're probably right in that statement, is that if you were to look at Tennessee and Kentucky, there's not a ton of difference in the water and in the farming practices as far as what's available. Southern Tennessee gets a little drier and more clayish, and you might see more cotton in West Tennessee. But when you get into Central Tennessee and East Tennessee, you're still going to pick up your corns. You're going to pick up all the same types of things. And so there's nothing preventing them from being a whiskey powerhouse, except for maybe this necessity they have of trying to differentiate Tennessee whiskey from bourbon. And rightfully so. They want to kind of put their own mark on it. But it's this Leaper's Fork, low volume, low impact concept of production. They do 100% of their own stuff. They haven't been doing any sourcing. They're maxed out at like 25,000 gallons of whiskey annually. They got a Tennessee whiskey, some bottled and bond stuff, cask strength stuff, and then white whiskeys and rye. And obviously for rye, that one gets a little more problematic because they're obviously picking their rye up from somewhere else, right? Because Tennessee's not known for its rye growing qualities, nor is Kentucky. If we're getting rye, we're buying it from some northern state. Because rye is, if anything, in the state of Kentucky or Tennessee, is going to be a cover crop that someone just happens to put down. And then staying for one last time, one last distillery that we're going to talk about in the Nashville area is going to be Corsair. And Corsair, I think, is probably one of the more interesting. I'm actually going to save drinking that one until last, because what I actually have from them is a triple smoke, which is going to be an American single malt whiskey that's been smoked, obviously. So it's going to have some pretty strong flavor to it. But this is a distillery that began sort of in Kentucky, sort of in Tennessee. It was founded in Bowling Green, and became and decided they wanted to shift into the Nashville market. And the distance between Bowling Green and Nashville is not very significant if you're looking at it from an interstate concept. But if you've ever had many of Corsair's things, they are, I don't know how to really describe it, but it's if you know anything about Nashville, if you know what Nashville was like about 20 years ago, I think this is a brand that epitomizes what Nashville was like. It's a little bit edgy. It's a little bit pre-hipster hip. They kind of do their own thing, and they have this just kind of wide variety of things that they've made over time. If you were to go to the distillery right now, you're going to try to find triple smoke, you're going to find a dark rye, and you're going to find an American gin. And then they do barrel-aged gins. In the past, they've done absinthe spiced rums. Just a ton of different, really, really unique things. If I remember correctly, they did a quinoa whiskey at one point in time, but they were, kind of highly lauded by um, foodie wine type people, whiskey advocate. They're going to be picked up by a lot of people as a very, very niche, small distillery. And if you ever go visit Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery, at the other end of the same plaza where they are is a location for Corsairs. Now, I did find some information that they're actually in the process of picking up some additional land to make a larger distillery. They're actually going to be trying to shift up to like a 24,000 barrels per year capacity, um, kind of grow out what they have as far as size. Because I think right now that their capacity is at about 1,000 barrels a year, and they're going to increase that by 24 times effectively. And so, Cheatham County, which is still staying in that same Nashville area, but it's it's a unique thing, and if you can pick up any of their distilled products, they're they've got some unique things going on. They've got a really, really unique situation. And then shifting to the next one, moving a little bit away from Nashville, moving to kind of the southeastern portion of the state a little bit. And Scott has already hopped on this for me and said, Chattanooga whiskey. Chattanooga whiskey is in obviously Chattanooga, Tennessee, and it's Chattanooga has a rich distilling history. They actually kind of began their process in 2011, and if you find some people that were following them early on, there's a lot of people that didn't necessarily care for what they had at that point in time. But as with any new craft distillery, you got to find your identity, you got to find your flavor profile, and you got to have the time to be able to lay down some distillate that's going to stick around for a while. And so they really didn't begin crafting their own bourbon until like a malt forward kind of bourbon until 2015, and then they kind of moved into what they're calling a Tennessee high malt in 2019, and then they just sort of explode with experimental batches. And so I've got a cask strength whiskey of theirs, which is absolutely very malt forward. But if you look at their Tennessee high malts, there's a straight rye malt whiskey, straight bourbon whiskey, a host of different things. But their experimental batches are the place where you can kind of find some real significant differentiation and what's happening, the things that other people weren't doing. And so if I go to their website right now and I look at current releases, I see a Muscatel and Sauternes barrel finish, a bourbon barrel gin, Appalachian grist, and that is grain that is going to be exclusively sourced from the Appalachian Valley growing region. And so the Appalachian Valley is going to be the mountains that are right there in and around eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, western North Carolina. The Appalachians kind of run up into Kentucky at that point. And so they're running rye, wheat, and rye malt, wheat malt, and bourbon. And so they're actually picking up rye from that region, which is incredibly difficult. There's mint infused. There's mint infused whiskey, Nocino, which I don't even know what that is, aquavit. There's just a ton of unique things. A tequila finish, if I remember correctly, I think they did an absinthe finish, rum, coffee, mead, maple syrup. And so some of these are going back to times before everyone else was hopping on these experimental batch finishes. And that's kind of been their thing, is they kind of got their legs underneath them and making some really, really solid bourbon and whiskey in the state of Tennessee. And then they said, all right, let's go out and try out these experimental things. And being a smaller distillery allows for that. And they're on batch 27 of their experimental batches, but because they're smaller, they can do these one-off experiments and see, is this going to work? Is this going to be unique flavor? And then they kind of move on to the next thing that kind of comes along the way. And so it's something that they're doing, right? And I think that there's a lot to be talked about with what they've got going on. And then Then one of the last ones that we're going to talk about that I think probably has one of the most significant potential futures is going to be one of the newer players in the Tennessee whiskey game. And I'm not saying Tennessee whiskey in the fact that they are a Tennessee whiskey only distillery. They're making other things. And the fact that I don't know that we're drinking anything that they've actually distilled yet. And so the last one that I'm going to kind of kick over and talk about in the state of Tennessee is going to be Company Distilling. And Company Distilling is this brainchild of a former Jack Daniels employee. Master distiller of Jack Daniels, did a handful of other things, decided that it was time, after 10 years of work and 8 new products in Jack Daniels portfolio, which may not sound like much for somebody the size of Jack Daniels, but for a company that, at least a lot of these legacy companies, are very hard pressed to start up new lines, new products, new concepts, because Jack Daniels is Jack Daniels. Why would we make anything else? We can continue to be incredibly profitable. So Jeff steps out and decides he's going to leave Jack Daniels and kind of do his own thing. He wants to make his own whiskey, and one of the things that he's looking for is that he's finishing in maple, which doesn't really change a ton of things. That flavor profile, it might change a ton of things. It does change a ton of things as far as classification, but he decided that he wanted to make his own brand, and so kind of kicked it off and looks to be putting a distillery together in Townsend. And Townsend, you have maybe 4 regions in the state of Tennessee. You have West Tennessee, which is going to be Memphis. Then you have Middle Tennessee, which is going to be Nashville area. East Tennessee is going to be around the Knoxville, Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge area, and then Chattanooga. It's not even really a region. It's just a southwestern tip of the eastern region, but it's its own unique city. And so Townsend sits right next to the Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge area, and it sort of feels like the place that people that are tired of the kitschy shit that exists in Gatlinburg are starting to shift into. You still have your ability to get a decent cabin that's kind of in the woods, on the side of a mountain, where you can go and spend a fall or a spring weekend. Maybe you have a hot tub, maybe you go eat something unique in the area, but you're not stuck in touristy, trafficy things. Like if you drive into Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, you see a Titanic ship sinking on the side of the ground and a building that's upside down because they have all of these dinner theaters and experiences. And it's a unique experience. Everybody wants to, a lot of people will go there. You can call it the Redneck Riviera or whatever you want to call it. But Townsend is just west of that, and it's maintaining this small mountain town vibe. And that's the only thing I can think is that when they're trying to identify a location where they want to put their distillery, they're going to have some scenic vibes. You're going to have huge availability of tourism, but it's also in a town where they're not having to deal with the things that come from Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, like all of those being moderately major metropolitan areas. They're going to have a lot of things to deal with, and so, they're pushing to put a distillery in Townsend. I think it's going to be, kind of an interesting selection. I want to see what they've got going on. And obviously, their whiskey that they're currently using is really good. It's obviously not anything that they distilled, unless it's something that he picked up, that he distilled himself when he was at Jack Daniels. He's able to pick this up. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but they've got a 90 proof 90 proof whiskey that's sitting on the shelves every day right now. You can go out and kind of buy it. That smoke is apparent. So those are the when we're talking about, like, we're talking about Tennessee whiskey, and we're talking about um, kind of differentiating from Jack Daniels specifically, but not being afraid of Dickel. But then there's still this whole other world of things. And I only talked about the brands I talked about because I have some of those bottles in hand, and because there's a few that I left out, mainly for a handful of reasons. So if we talk about Blue Note, Blue Note's up and coming distillery slash brand out of the Memphis area. Hoping to have them join me for an episode here pretty soon, so I don't want to talk about it too much ahead of time. Old Dominic, which is going to be the Old Dominic line, or Huling Station. Haven't had any other whiskey. Can't really talk about it a ton. Nelson's Greenbrier. I've talked about them before. I will talk about them again, and hopefully sometime in November, the Nelson brothers will be joining me. We'll run through an interview, have a series of conversations, and maybe it'll be interesting. And then there's Pritchard's. And Pritchard's, I think, is kind of becoming my, very specifically, my white whale of whiskey. I have a coworker who has been after a bottle of Pritchard's Double Oak for as long as he knew I was into whiskey. And so every time I'm out and in the area, I'm looking for it. And it appears that it might be at a distillery only release that is only going to happen every, fifth year on the third Sunday in February, if the moon is just right. It's just one of those things that's not available. But it's a really, really small boutique size distillery that does a ton of other things. Old Glory, which is in Clarksville, Tennessee, is within driving distance of here. And so I've got an episode that I'm working on for that. Pennington Distillery, which does Davidson Reserve. They have a bunch of stuff. I've got that bottle. I haven't been able to taste it yet. And I'm kind of working my way through it and figuring out what I want to do with them. And then more recently, Nashville Barrel Company. If you are into single barrel selections, you know who Nashville Barrel Company is. This is not a new name for you. It's not a new concept. And they've really kind of blown up in the last 9 months, 12 months or whatever. The only thing, the main reason I'm not talking about them is I think that they maybe have outstripped, as far as their pricing, they may have outstripped the value, at least in my mindset. It's incredibly popular. Everybody's clamoring for one, but I just don't know if the price meets the quality. And that's me speaking from not having a bottle on hand of Nashville Barrel Company. I've had tastings at several different places, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but it's almost like a limited allocation or limited allotment bottle that's available for people. Everybody's out there kind of clamoring for it. And maybe they understood inflation before everybody else did, and so they priced appropriately. I don't know. It's just kind of off my radar for the moment. Also, because I'm generically trying to avoid the city of Nashville, just because Nashville is not built to handle the amount of people that live, commute, and tourist themselves in that city. They've got a lot of growing to do, and I have a very distinct feeling. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a wedding outside of Nashville in a small town, and I was talking to one of the locals to Nashville, and he and a bunch of people that live in Nashville have this idea that what's going to happen is that the lack of Nashville's ability to get its infrastructure up to snuff for the size of people, the lack of their ability to do it quickly is going to put them in a position where people are going to start leaving as they're finishing these projects. And so they're going to finish a ton of these infrastructure projects, but the population's not going to be there anymore. And so it's going to be really easy to get around, but it's also going to look maybe like Detroit for a little while, where people are leaving in droves and going to other states. And a lot of people are going from Nashville to North Carolina now. It's just this weird migration of people that are sort of happening. But I'm rambling at this point. 35 minutes. We've covered a whole lot of content. And so kind of going back, Tennessee whiskey, it's just a straight whiskey that's produced in the state of Tennessee. Most of the time it aligns with bourbon. But there's also going to be Tennessee single malts. There's going to be a ton of different things that are happening in the state. While there are a lot of people who are like, oh, Tennessee whiskey's got a minerality to it, it's not necessarily the case. We just outlined, aside from George Dickel, which some people feel like it's bad and some people don't. Wheeler's Raid, Leaper's Fork, Corsair Distillery, Chattanooga Whiskey, Company Distilling are just a small smattering of distilleries that are in the state of Tennessee that are making great whiskey day in and day out. It kind of it's getting its own namesake. And then Nelson's Greenbrier is helping lead that charge, but you can't give them a ton of credit because their flagship brand, which was Belle Meade, was largely sourced whiskey. Now they did start making their own Nelson's Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey, but that's not their premier brand. They're still sticking with their sourced bourbon, which is fantastic, and I think that's their bread and butter and what they should stay with. But it is drawing some attention to the state of Tennessee. And so that's all we've got for tonight. Thanks for tuning in for this offering of the Embellish podcast. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you are consuming this on. Leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media at Twitter or Instagram using Embellish Pod, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can also be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, contact details, and more. I'll be back again next week with another new offering for you. So until then, cheers and thanks for hanging out.